We challenge you to listen to Khalil's story without judging, without thinking, I would have done things differently. Because until you've lived with hunger as your constant companion and fear as your bedfellow, you can't know what choices you'd make. But we also challenge you to listen with hope, because if Khalil's life could change, anyone can. Khalil's earliest memory wasn't of a warm embrace or a childhood toy. It was the gnawing pain of hunger, a constant companion that shaped his world from the moment he could form thoughts. This wasn't the kind of hunger that could be satisfied by a quick snack or a missed meal. It was a deep, relentless ache that consumed his every waking moment. In Khalil's neighborhood, struggle was the norm. Every day was a battle for basic necessities: food, clean clothes, a safe place to sleep. He learned early on that nothing came easy. While other kids his age worried about homework or playground games, Khalil's mind was occupied with more pressing concerns. Where would his next meal come from? Would there be electricity in the apartment tonight? Would his father come home angry again? The contrast between Khalil's reality and the world outside his home was stark and painful. He'd watch other families through windows or on rare trips outside his neighborhood, seeing glimpses of a life that seemed as distant as a fairy tale. Happy children with full bellies, parents who smiled and laughed together, homes that looked warm and inviting. It was a world Khalil could see but never touch, separated by an invisible barrier of poverty and circumstance. The constant deprivation took its toll, not just physically, but emotionally. Khalil's small frame bore witness to years of malnutrition, his growth stunted, his immune system weakened. Dark circles permanently resided under his eyes, a testament to nights spent awake from hunger pains or fear. But the emotional scars ran deeper. Shame became a constant companion, rivaling even hunger in its persistence. Khalil learned to hide his circumstances, to make excuses for his shabby clothes and frequent absences from school. How did Khalil cope with these seemingly insurmountable challenges? With a resourcefulness born of desperation. He became an expert at finding discarded food that was still edible, knowing which dumpsters behind which restaurants might yield a half-eaten meal. He learned to charm the lunch ladies at school, sometimes scoring an extra portion that he could take home to his younger siblings. Khalil developed a sixth sense for danger, knowing which streets to avoid and which abandoned buildings might offer temporary shelter when home wasn't safe. But Khalil's resourcefulness came at a cost. Each day spent focused solely on survival was a day lost to childhood, to learning, to dreaming of a different future. The skills that kept him alive on the streets were the very things that set him apart from his peers, making it harder to fit in or imagine a life beyond the cycle of poverty. As Khalil grew older, his ability to navigate this harsh world only increased, but so did the risks he faced and the compromises he had to make. Survival, it turned out, exacted its own steep price. While Khalil had become adept at finding food and avoiding danger outside, he was about to face a threat no child should ever have to confront. How do you protect yourself when the monster isn't hiding under the bed, but is the one tucking you in at night? For Khalil, true terror had a distinct sound. His father's heavy footsteps approaching the front door. The familiar cadence sent shivers down his spine, his body tensing as he braced for what might come next. Home, which should have been a sanctuary, had become a battlefield where peace was as fleeting as a candle flame in a storm. One particularly harrowing night stood out in Khalil's memory. His father had stumbled in, reeking of alcohol and frustration after another failed job interview. The tension in the air was palpable as Khalil's mother tried to soothe him, her voice soft and placating. But her efforts only seemed to fuel his anger. In a flash, his father's hand struck out, connecting with his mother's cheek with a sickening crack. Khalil, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, watched in horror as his mother crumpled to the floor. This scene, in various forms, played out with alarming frequency in their small apartment. The cycle was brutally predictable. Unemployment led to frustration, frustration to drinking, and drinking to violence. Each time, Khalil hoped it would be the last, but that hope grew dimmer with each passing day. The effects of this environment on Khalil were profound and far-reaching. For Khalil, the constant state of hypervigilance became his norm. He learned to read the subtle signs of impending violence, the slight change in his father's tone, the tightening of his jaw, the way his fists clenched and unclenched. This toxic environment shaped Khalil's worldview in ways he wouldn't fully understand until much later. Trust became a foreign concept, something for other people who lived in safer, happier homes. The world, in Khalil's eyes, was a dangerous place where love and violence were inextricably linked. Yet, amidst this darkness, a fierce protective instinct blossomed in Khalil. He became a shield for his younger siblings, often placing himself between them and their father's rage. When the shouting started, Khalil would usher them into the small closet in their shared bedroom, spinning fantastical stories to drown out the sounds of conflict. He'd whisper promises of a better future, even as he struggled to believe in one himself. The weight of this responsibility was crushing, a burden no child should have to bear. Yet Khalil shouldered it without complaint, knowing that for his siblings, he was the only barrier between them and the harsh realities of their home life. While Khalil fought to keep his family safe, another battle raged silently in the background. Picture a world where attending school feels like a selfish act. For Khalil, each day brought an impossible choice: feed his mind or feed his family. The classroom beckoned with promises of a brighter future, but at what immediate cost? Khalil's relationship with education was a tangled web of longing and guilt. School represented a temporary escape from the harsh realities of home, a place where he could momentarily forget about empty stomachs and angry fists. The cool, quiet classrooms were a stark contrast to the chaos that awaited him at home. Yet every minute spent at his desk felt like a betrayal of his responsibilities. As he sat in class, trying to focus on math problems or history lessons, Khalil's mind would drift to his siblings. Were they safe? Had they found something to eat? The gnawing worry made it nearly impossible to concentrate. His grades suffered, not from lack of intelligence, but from the weight of his divided attention. Khalil's frequent absences only compounded the problem. Some days, he simply couldn't risk leaving his siblings alone. Other times, the need to find food or odd jobs to earn money took precedence over attendance. Each missed day widened the gap between Khalil and his classmates, making it harder to catch up when he did manage to attend. The statistics painted a grim picture of Khalil's situation. By high school, only 60% of students in Khalil's neighborhood were expected to graduate. These numbers weren't just abstract figures to Khalil. They were the faces of friends who disappeared from class, never to return. As Khalil fell further behind, he couldn't help but wonder about the opportunities slipping through his fingers. What doors would remain forever closed to him without an education? He saw classmates talking excitedly about college plans and future careers, conversations that felt as foreign to him as discussions of life on another planet. Despite the seemingly insurmountable odds, Khalil's thirst for knowledge refused to be quenched. He developed creative ways to educate himself outside the classroom. Public libraries became his sanctuary, offering not just warmth and safety, but access to a world of information. He'd spend hours poring over books, absorbing everything from basic math to advanced literature. Khalil also became an expert at learning through observation. He'd listen intently to conversations on the bus or in stores, picking up bits of knowledge about history, science, and current events. Discarded newspapers became valuable sources of information, and he'd often rescue half-completed workbooks from school dumpsters, filling in the blank pages with his own studies. But as resourceful as Khalil was, he knew that self-education had its limits. Without guidance, structure, and the opportunity to engage with others, there were gaps in his knowledge that he couldn't fill on his own. The world was changing rapidly, and Khalil feared that his patchwork education might not be enough to keep up. Hunger had driven Khalil to the edge of his moral boundaries. Years of deprivation led him to the church pantry door, unaware of how this act of desperation would reshape his future. The church stood as a beacon in Khalil's food-scarce neighborhood. His plan, born of countless nights with empty stomachs, was simple: slip in, grab what he could, and vanish before anyone noticed. Khalil's heart raced as he eased the door open. The shelves before him held a bounty of sustenance: canned goods, pasta, peanut butter. His hands trembled as he reached for the first item, its weight both a comfort and a source of shame. Fate intervened. Just as Khalil's backpack began to fill, a gentle voice cut through the silence.
"Can I help you with something?"
The words hit Khalil like a physical blow. He froze, caught in the act by those he was stealing from. Fear of consequences warred with the primal need to provide for his family. Shame burned hot in his chest, but underneath it all, a tiny spark of defiance flickered. What choice did he have when the world had turned its back on him? As Khalil turned to face the voice, bracing for anger or punishment, he was met with unexpected concern. The pastor stood there, his expression not one of judgment, but of compassion.
"You look hungry,"
he said simply.
"Why don't we sit down and talk about getting you some food? The right way."
The kindness in the pastor's voice was almost unbearable. It cut through Khalil's defenses, leaving him raw and vulnerable. For a moment, he considered fleeing, but something in the pastor's eyes, a genuine warmth, made him pause. Overwhelmed, Khalil found himself nodding, following the pastor to a small office. As he sank into a chair, the weight of his actions and this unexpected turn crashed over him. Could he trust this sudden act of grace? Or was it just another setup for disappointment? As the pastor began to speak, Khalil remained on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Little did he know, this conversation was about to open a door to a world he never knew existed. A world where kindness came without strings, and hope wasn't just a distant dream. As the pastor's gentle voice broke the silence, Khalil felt his defenses wavering.
"Khalil, have you ever considered that there might be a love powerful enough to heal even your deepest wounds?"
The question hung in the air, both terrifying and intriguing. Could such a thing truly exist, or was it just another empty promise? Khalil's mind raced, torn between hope and skepticism. He'd learned early on that love often came with conditions, with pain. Yet something in the pastor's eyes spoke of a different kind of love, one he'd never encountered before.
"I know it might be hard to believe,"
the pastor continued, sensing Khalil's internal struggle.
"but God's love isn't like anything you've experienced before. It's unconditional, unending, and it's for you, Khalil, no matter what you've done or what's been done to you."
Khalil's heart clenched at these words. He wanted to believe, desperately, but years of disappointment and betrayal had built walls around his heart that seemed impenetrable. The pastor leaned forward, his eyes kind but intense.
"Let me tell you a story, Khalil. It's about a man who was rejected by everyone, who suffered more than most of us can imagine. Yet through it all, he never lost sight of love."
As the pastor's words painted a vivid picture, Khalil found himself drawn in despite his reservations. The story of a man who faced betrayal, abandonment, and unimaginable pain resonated deeply with his own experiences. Yet this man's response, forgiveness, love, and sacrifice, was so foreign to Khalil that it almost seemed impossible.
How?
Khalil found himself asking, his voice barely above a whisper.
How could anyone love like that after everything?
The pastor's smile was gentle.
That's the beauty of God's love, Khalil. It's not based on what we do or don't do. It's based on who He is. And He wants to show you that love, to heal those wounds you've been carrying for so long.
Khalil felt something stirring within him, a tiny spark of hope he thought had long been extinguished. Could there really be a love powerful enough to overcome the darkness he'd known? A part of him wanted to run, to protect himself from the disappointment he was sure would follow. But another part, a part he barely recognized, wanted to stay, to learn more.
I don't know if I can believe all this,
Khalil admitted, his voice shaky.
But maybe I could try?
The pastor's face lit up.
That's all it takes, Khalil. Just a willingness to try. We have a youth group that meets every week. Why don't you come by? No pressure, just a chance to explore this more, to meet some other kids who are on similar journeys.
Khalil nodded slowly, surprised to find himself agreeing. As he left the church that day, his backpack now filled with freely given food instead of stolen goods, he felt a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. Hope, fear, confusion, and just a hint of something that might have been excitement. But old habits die hard, and as Khalil walked home, He couldn't help but wonder if this newfound hope would shatter like all the others before it. Imagine feeling safe for the first time in your life. Now imagine how terrifying that can be. As Khalil stepped into the church's youth group, he was about to discover that sometimes the hardest thing to accept isn't cruelty, it's kindness. The room buzzed with laughter and chatter, a stark contrast to the tense silence Khalil was accustomed to at home. Bright posters adorned the walls, and the smell of pizza wafted through the air. Khalil's stomach growled, but he hesitated, unsure if the food was truly meant for him. A girl with a wide smile approached, her hand extended in greeting. Khalil flinched involuntarily, his body reacting before his mind could process that this wasn't a threat. The girl's smile faltered for a moment, but she pressed on, introducing herself as Sarah and welcoming him to the group. As the evening progressed, Khalil found himself caught between two worlds. Here, adults spoke gently, their eyes warm and encouraging. Teenagers laughed freely, without the edge of bitterness he was used to hearing. When someone bumped into him, they apologized instead of lashing out. It was as if he'd stepped into an alternate reality, where kindness was the norm, not the exception. The youth leader, a man named Mike, approached Khalil during a game.
You doing okay?
He asked, his voice low and free of judgment. Khalil nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Mike didn't push, just patted him on the shoulder and moved on. That simple interaction left Khalil reeling. No demands, no hidden agenda, just genuine concern. As the weeks passed, Khalil found himself looking forward to these gatherings. They became an anchor in his turbulent life, a few hours where he could breathe easier and let his guard down, if only a little. He began to recognize faces, to anticipate the warm greetings he'd receive. However, the old patterns of his guarded life still remained. Khalil still sat near exits, his eyes constantly scanning for potential threats. He flinched at sudden movements and struggled to join in group activities. The other kids noticed, of course. Some whispered, some stared, but most just accepted him as he was, gradually including him in their circles. One night, during a discussion about family, Khalil felt panic rising in his chest. The other kids spoke of movie nights and family dinners, experiences so far removed from his reality that they might as well have been describing life on another planet. When it was his turn to share, Khalil froze, shame and fear warring within him. Mike, sensing Khalil's distress, smoothly redirected the conversation. Later, he pulled Khalil aside.
You don't have to share anything you're not comfortable with,
He said softly.
but know that when you're ready, we're here to listen without judgment.
Those words were a lifeline to Khalil. For the first time, he felt seen, not just his struggles, but his strength in surviving them. As Khalil walked home that night, the contrast between the warmth of the youth group and the cold reality of his home life was starker than ever. He clung to the memory of laughter, of casual touches that didn't hurt, of eyes that looked at him with kindness instead of contempt. But as he approached his apartment building, familiar dread settled in his stomach. The past wasn't ready to let go just yet. Khalil's footsteps slowed as he approached his building, the weight of his two worlds pressing down on him. He'd tasted something beautiful at the youth group, but a voice in his head whispered that he didn't deserve it. Could someone like him ever truly belong in a place of love and acceptance? Or was he destined to sabotage this chance at a better life? As Khalil climbed the stairs to his apartment, his mind raced with conflicting emotions. The warmth and kindness he'd experienced at the youth group felt like a dream, too good to be true. He remembered Sarah's welcoming smile, Mike's gentle encouragement, and the laughter that filled the room. But with each step, the familiar dread of his home life crept back in, threatening to extinguish the small flame of hope that had begun to flicker within him. Khalil paused outside his door, his hand hovering over the knob. The contrast between the two worlds he now inhabited was stark and jarring. In one, he was welcomed and valued. In the other, he was a target for his father's rage and a shield for his siblings. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. As days passed, Khalil found himself caught in an internal tug of war. Every kind word from the youth group members was met with suspicion. Every offer of help was scrutinized for hidden motives. He'd catch himself smiling during group activities, only to immediately withdraw, convinced he was setting himself up for disappointment. One evening, during a group discussion about future goals, Khalil surprised himself by sharing his dream of becoming a teacher. The room erupted in supportive cheers, but Khalil immediately regretted opening up. He spent the rest of the night quiet and withdrawn, berating himself for daring to voice such an impossible aspiration. Khalil's moments of regression became more frequent. He'd skip meetings, making excuses about family obligations. When he did attend, he'd sit far from the group, building invisible walls around himself. His responses became curt, almost hostile at times, as if daring the others to give up on him. Mike, the youth leader, watched Khalil struggle with growing concern. He recognized the signs of a child grappling with trust issues, a common challenge for survivors of abuse. One night, after Khalil had spent the entire meeting in stony silence, Mike approached him.
Khalil,
Mike said softly.
I see you fighting against something. I want you to know that whatever it is, you don't have to face it alone.
Khalil's eyes widened, his defenses momentarily faltering. Mike's words had pierced through the armor he'd so carefully constructed. For a brief moment, Khalil allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could trust this man. As Khalil left that night, a small seed of hope had been planted, but the real test was yet to come. The journey from survival to trust was a long and treacherous one, and Khalil was only at the beginning. Khalil gripped his suitcase, the weight unfamiliar and daunting. It represented more than just clothes for a weekend retreat. It was a step into the unknown, away from the constant vigilance of his daily life. As he stood in the church parking lot, surrounded by the excited chatter of his peers, Khalil felt like an outsider peering into a world he didn't quite understand. Mike, the youth leader, approached with a gentle smile.
Ready for an adventure, Khalil?
The question hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Khalil managed a small nod, unable to voice the storm of emotions swirling inside him. As he climbed into the van, guilt gnawed at him for leaving his siblings behind, even as a part of him yearned for a temporary reprieve from his responsibilities. The journey to the retreat center blurred past the windows, each mile stirring a confusing mix of anxiety and anticipation in Khalil's chest. The familiar sights of his neighborhood faded, replaced by towering pines and crisp, clean air. The stark contrast to his usual surroundings only heightened Khalil's sense of displacement. That first night, lying in an unfamiliar bed, Khalil found himself caught between conflicting emotions. His ears strained for any unfamiliar sound in the quiet cabin, old habits refusing to let go. Yet beneath the anxiety, a strange sense of relief began to take root. For the first time in years, he didn't have to worry about his father's footsteps or his siblings' empty stomachs. The realization brought tears to his eyes, tears of guilt, of grief for the childhood he never had, but also tears of something that felt dangerously close to hope. As Khalil drifted off to sleep, lulled by the gentle snores of his cabin mates, he couldn't have known that the real transformation was yet to unfold. The next few days would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself, about trust, and about the possibility of a different kind of life. The air in the retreat center felt charged with an energy Khalil had never experienced before. As he stood among his peers during a worship session, a strange warmth began to spread through his chest. Was this the beginning of the transformation he'd been promised, or was his mind playing tricks on him? Khalil's heart raced as the music swelled around him. His peers swayed with their eyes closed, hands raised in worship. He felt a pull to join them, but his body remained rigid, years of self-protection warring against this unfamiliar urge to let go. The song reached its crescendo, and Khalil felt something shift inside him. It was as if a dam had broken, releasing a flood of emotions he'd long suppressed. Tears welled up in his eyes, catching him off guard. He blinked rapidly, trying to stem the flow, but it was useless. A presence enveloped him, warm and comforting like a blanket. Khalil's breath caught in his throat. He'd never felt anything like this before, a sense of being held, of being truly seen. The walls he'd built around his heart began to crumble. Khalil's legs trembled, and he sank to his knees. The hard floor beneath him faded away, as wave after wave of what he could only describe as love washed over him. It was overwhelming, terrifying, and yet more right than anything he'd ever known. Memories flashed through his mind. The hunger, the fear, the constant struggle. But now, each painful recollection was met with a counterpoint of compassion. Khalil saw himself through new eyes, not as a burden or a failure, but as someone worthy of love. A sob escaped his lips, raw and unrestrained. Khalil buried his face in his hands, his body shaking with the force of his tears. Years of pent-up pain and longing poured out of him. He felt a gentle hand on his shoulder and looked up to see Mike kneeling beside him. The youth leader's eyes were filled with understanding and acceptance.
It's okay.
Mike said softly.
Let it out. You're safe here.
Those simple words broke the last of Khalil's resistance. He leaned into Mike's embrace, allowing himself to be held as he wept. For the first time in his life, Khalil felt truly seen, truly known, and unconditionally loved. As the tears subsided, a profound sense of peace settled over Khalil. The chaos in his mind quieted, replaced by a certainty he couldn't explain. He knew, with unshakable conviction, that he was loved by a God who saw his pain and wanted to heal it. Khalil stood on shaky legs, his face tear-stained, but his eyes bright with newfound hope. He looked around at his fellow retreat-goers, seeing them in a new light. These weren't just acquaintances or potential threats. They were family, bound together by a love that transcended human understanding. As the group moved into a time of prayer and reflection, Khalil found himself opening up in ways he never had before. He shared snippets of his story, his voice trembling, but growing stronger with each word. The weight of secrets he'd carried for so long began to lift. But as powerful as this moment was, Khalil knew it was just the beginning. Accepting love was one thing. Learning to live in it would be another challenge entirely. As the retreat drew to a close, Khalil braced himself for the return to his everyday reality, wondering how this transformation would hold up against the harsh realities of his life. Khalil's return home from the retreat thrust him into a profound internal struggle. The divine love he had experienced now faced its greatest challenge, extending forgiveness to the man who had caused him immense suffering. As he lay in bed that first night, memories of his father's abuse flooded his mind, each recollection sending a shiver down his spine. Days blurred into weeks as Khalil grappled with his conflicting emotions. He found solace in youth group meetings, where Mike listened patiently as he poured out his heart. Khalil immersed himself in books and articles about forgiveness, learning that it was a process of releasing the hold that anger and resentment had on his life. Gradually, Khalil noticed subtle changes within himself. The constant knot of tension in his stomach began to loosen, and he found himself able to think about his father without an immediate surge of anger. These small shifts gave him hope, even as he continued to struggle. One night, as Khalil prayed, a sudden clarity washed over him. He realized that forgiving his father wasn't about the man who had hurt him. It was about freeing himself from the prison of bitterness he had built. With tears streaming down his face, Khalil made a choice to pursue forgiveness, not because his father deserved it, but because he deserved peace. This decision marked a turning point, but Khalil knew the real work was just beginning. As he prepared to face his father, a mix of determination and fear coursed through him. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Khalil felt a glimmer of hope that healing was possible. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the conversation that could change everything. But as he would soon discover, the decision to forgive was merely the first step on a long and challenging journey. Khalil stood outside his childhood home, hand trembling on the doorknob. The moment he'd both longed for and dreaded had arrived. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door, the familiar scent of stale cigarettes and cheap beer assaulting his senses. His father sat in the dimly lit living room, TV flickering in the background. As Khalil approached, surprise flashed across his father's face.
What do you want?
His father growled, words slightly slurred. Khalil's heart raced, but his voice remained steady.
We need to talk, Dad.
The word dad felt foreign on his tongue. His father's eyes narrowed.
Talk about what? You come here to lecture me?
No,
Khalil said softly.
I came to tell you something important. I forgive you.
The words hung in the air, heavy with years of unspoken pain. His father's face contorted, a mix of emotions flashing across his features.
You what?
His father sputtered, rising unsteadily.
You forgive me? Who do you think you are?
I'm your son.
Khalil replied.
And I'm tired of carrying this anger.
For a moment, Khalil thought his father might lash out. Instead, his shoulders slumped, and he sank back into his chair, suddenly looking old and vulnerable.
You don't know what you're talking about.
His father muttered, shame creeping into his voice. Khalil moved closer.
Maybe I don't, but I want to try to understand. Can we talk? Really talk?
His father looked up, meeting Khalil's eyes for what felt like the first time in years. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken words and missed opportunities. Finally, his father nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. As Khalil pulled up a chair, he knew this was just the beginning. One conversation couldn't erase years of pain and mistrust, but it was a start, a small crack in the wall that had separated them for so long. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, Khalil felt a glimmer of hope that healing might be possible, not just for himself, but for his father too. Khalil's newfound belief in healing was just the first step. But could he truly escape the gravitational pull of his past? As he stood at the crossroads of his future, Khalil faced a stark choice: fall back into familiar patterns, or forge a radically different path. The realization hit Khalil like a thunderbolt. He could choose a different life. The cycle of abuse and poverty that had defined his family for generations didn't have to continue with him. It was a heady, almost terrifying thought. Khalil's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of his bed, the weight of possibility pressing down on him. Determination surged through Khalil's veins as he made a silent vow. He would break free, no matter the cost. But the path forward was far from clear. Old habits tugged at him, whispering of the comfort of the familiar. The streets he knew, the survival skills he'd honed. They called to him with siren-like persistence. Yet the promise of a new life, glimpsed during his time at the youth group and retreat, pushed him forward with equal force. Khalil began taking practical steps towards independence. He threw himself into his studies with renewed vigor, knowing education was his ticket out. Every free moment was spent at the library, poring over books and using the computers to research job opportunities and scholarships. He even swallowed his pride and asked Mike for help creating a resume. Obstacles loomed large on Khalil's journey. Financial instability threatened to derail his plans at every turn. The pull of old friends involved in less than legal activities tested his resolve. Worst of all was the voice in his head, echoing his father's words, telling him he'd never amount to anything. But Khalil persevered. He found a part-time job at a local grocery store, carefully saving every penny. He distanced himself from negative influences, instead surrounding himself with supportive people from the youth group. And each time that critical inner voice spoke up, Khalil countered it with affirmations of his worth and potential. The defining moment came when Khalil received his first college acceptance letter. His hand shook as he read the words, scarcely daring to believe it was real. In that instant, Khalil made a decision that flew in the face of everything his upbringing had taught him. He would go to college, even if it meant leaving behind the only world he'd ever known. As Khalil shared the news with his family, the mix of pride and fear on his mother's face spoke volumes. She pulled him into a tight embrace, whispering words of encouragement. But the road ahead was far from smooth. Khalil's faith journey deepened as he found solace in his church community. The warmth of the congregation and the comforting rhythms of worship provided a sense of belonging he had long sought. Yet, as his faith grew, Khalil grappled with difficult questions about God's role in his past suffering. During a powerful sermon, Khalil experienced a shift in understanding. The priest's words resonated deeply.
Sometimes our deepest wounds become our greatest teachers. God doesn't cause our suffering, but He can use it to shape us, to help us grow in compassion and strength.
This perspective transformed Khalil's outlook. He began to view his past not just as trauma, but as a source of wisdom and empathy. This new lens informed his daily life, bringing a resilience he had never known before. When faced with challenges, Khalil found himself pausing to pray, seeking guidance and wisdom. The anger that had once simmered beneath the surface faded, replaced by an unfamiliar sense of peace. As Khalil prepared for college, he wondered how his newfound faith would withstand the scrutiny of academia and peer pressure. He held on to the belief that his past struggles had meaning, shaping him into the person he was becoming. Looking towards the future, Khalil felt a mix of apprehension and excitement. His faith had given him a new perspective, but he knew it alone couldn't solve all of life's challenges. The real work was just beginning. Khalil's heart raced as he scanned the class roster, his name nestled among unfamiliar ones. Pride and anxiety washed over him in equal measure. This was his first step back into formal education after years of struggle and missed opportunities. In the classroom, Khalil felt out of place. The professor's words rushed over him in a confusing torrent, years of educational gaps leaving him struggling to grasp even basic concepts. That night, he sat at his small desk, the enormity of the challenge threatening to overwhelm him. But as he thought of the life he was fighting to create, a steely resolve took hold. Khalil threw himself into his studies with fierce determination. He joined study groups, swallowing his pride to ask questions about things his classmates seemed to understand instinctively. The constant mental strain took its toll, but Khalil refused to give up. As the semester progressed, Khalil found himself gradually transforming. With each small victory, his confidence grew. He began to see himself not as a victim of circumstance, but as someone capable of shaping his own destiny. Concepts that once seemed impenetrable slowly became clear, and he started to participate more in class discussions. The day Khalil received his first A on an essay, he stared at the paper in disbelief. The red mark represented more than just a grade. It was tangible proof that he belonged, that he could succeed. He carefully tucked the essay away, a talisman against future moments of doubt. Yet even as Khalil reveled in his success, a shadow of guilt crept in. He thought of his siblings still struggling in the old neighborhood, of friends who never got the chance he now had. The stark contrast between his new life and the one he left behind weighed heavily on his conscience. As Khalil prepared for his next class, he grappled with a new challenge: how to reconcile his personal growth with the pain of those left behind. Khalil stood nervously outside the community center, his fingers fidgeting with the strap of his backpack. The faded sign above the door read, "Youth Mentorship Program," and Khalil couldn't shake the feeling that he was making a mistake. How could he, with all his baggage and struggles, possibly guide someone else? As he stepped inside, the bustling energy of the center enveloped him. Teens lounged on worn couches, playing board games or chatting animatedly. A few adults moved among them, their expressions a mix of warmth and watchfulness. Khalil's eyes darted around, searching for an escape route.
"You must be Khalil,"
a voice said, startling him. A woman with kind eyes and graying hair approached, clipboard in hand.
"I'm Linda, the program coordinator. We're so glad you decided to join us as a mentor."
Khalil nodded, his throat tight.
I'm not sure I'm cut out for this.
He admitted softly. Linda's smile was understanding.
Many of our mentors feel that way at first, but your experiences, even the painful ones, can be a powerful tool in connecting with these kids.
As Linda led him through orientation, Khalil's doubts continued to swirl. He learned about the program's structure, safety protocols, and the importance of building trust. But with each passing minute, he felt more and more like an imposter. Then came the moment Khalil had been dreading, meeting his mentee. Marcus slouched into the room, his hoodie pulled low over his face. The boy's entire demeanor screamed defiance, but Khalil recognized the fear underneath. He'd worn that same armor for years. Their first conversation was stilted, filled with long silences and one-word answers from Marcus. Khalil fumbled, searching for the right words. How could he reach this kid when he still felt so lost himself? As weeks passed, Khalil and Marcus slowly found common ground. They bonded over shared experiences, the gnawing pain of hunger, the constant vigilance required in rough neighborhoods. Khalil found himself opening up about his past, sharing stories he'd kept buried for years. One afternoon, as they shot hoops in the center's small gym, Marcus finally cracked.
Why do you even bother with me?
He asked, his voice raw.
Everyone else has given up.
Khalil's chest tightened. He saw himself in Marcus. Angry, hurting, desperate for someone to believe in him. Taking a deep breath, Khalil began to share his story in earnest. He spoke of the abuse, the hunger, the hopelessness. But he also spoke of the people who had reached out to him, offering a lifeline when he needed it most. As he talked, Khalil felt something shift inside him. The act of sharing his past, of using it to connect with Marcus, began to heal wounds he didn't even know were still open. By the time Khalil finished speaking, both he and Marcus were sitting on the gym floor, the basketball forgotten. Marcus looked at Khalil with new respect.
You really made it out.
He said softly.
Maybe I can too.
Those words hit Khalil like a physical force. He realized that by sharing his story, he wasn't just helping Marcus. He was reframing his own narrative, seeing his past not just as a source of pain, but as a wellspring of strength and wisdom. As Khalil left the center that day, he felt lighter than he had in years. But a new challenge loomed on the horizon. Sharing his past meant reliving it, and some memories were still raw enough to burn. Khalil's new life was marred by an invisible battle. Sleep brought vivid replays of past traumas, leaving him drenched in sweat and gasping for air. Even awake, he found himself ambushed by sudden flashbacks, transporting him to moments of fear he thought he'd left behind. By day, Khalil excelled in his classes and mentored troubled youth. But as darkness fell, the contrast between his outward progress and inner turmoil became stark. The smell of cheap liquor or raised voices could send him spiraling, his heart racing as if he were still that scared little boy hiding from his father's rage. Recognizing the need for help, Khalil began seeing Dr. Reina, a therapist specializing in childhood trauma. Her office became a sanctuary where he could finally give voice to the pain he'd carried for so long. Together, they explored the depths of his experiences, unraveling the complex web of emotions that had shaped his worldview. Khalil learned that his struggles were symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. This knowledge both validated his experiences and forced him to confront the lasting impact of his past. He threw himself into the hard work of healing, developing a toolbox of coping strategies. Mindfulness techniques helped ground him during flashbacks. Journaling allowed him to track triggers and progress. Deep breathing exercises calmed his racing heart during moments of panic. Positive self-talk became a shield against the cruel voices of his past. Support groups introduced Khalil to others who shared similar struggles, reminding him that he wasn't alone. As he developed healthier ways of managing his trauma responses, he began to see his experiences in a new light. The pain that had once threatened to destroy him now fueled his empathy and drive to help others. Khalil realized that true healing wasn't about erasing the past, but integrating it into a stronger, more compassionate version of himself. This shift in perspective opened up new possibilities. As he continued to work through his trauma, Khalil felt increasingly drawn to the idea of using his experiences to make a difference in the world. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, he felt truly equipped to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Khalil stood at a crossroads, wrestling with the decision to share his story. The idea had struck him during a late-night study session, but the thought of baring his soul to strangers both thrilled and terrified him. For days, he paced his small apartment, torn between the desire to help others and the fear of exposing his vulnerabilities. What if people judged him? What if reliving his past reopened old wounds? But each time doubt crept in, Khalil thought of Marcus and the other kids he mentored. If his story could give them hope, wasn't it worth the risk? Finally, he made his choice. He would speak at an upcoming youth conference, sharing his journey from abuse and poverty to healing and purpose. As Khalil crafted his narrative, he realized how much he had changed. The words flowed easier now, the pain less raw. He focused on the points of light that had guided him forward, practicing relentlessly to refine each word and gesture. The day of the conference arrived, bringing with it a storm of nerves. Khalil's hands shook as he adjusted his tie, his stomach twisting with anxiety. As he took the stage, the sea of faces before him blurred. For a moment, he froze, his carefully prepared words escaping him. But then he took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and began to speak. As Khalil shared his story, the fear and hesitation melted away, replaced by a sense of purpose. He watched as expressions in the audience shifted from curiosity to empathy to hope. When he described his lowest moments, he saw tears in the eyes of hardened teens. And when he spoke of his transformation, he witnessed the spark of possibility igniting in their faces. After the speech, people lined up to speak with Khalil. One boy, his voice barely above a whisper, confided that Khalil's story had given him the courage to seek help for his own struggles. As Khalil left the conference hall that evening, he felt a profound sense of peace. He had taken his pain and transformed it into something beautiful, something that could light the way for others. By sharing his story, Khalil had stepped into a new role, one that carried both privilege and responsibility. The path ahead would require courage, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to hope. Khalil's story had ignited a passion to spread hope in his community's darkest corners. The image of countless kids trapped in cycles of poverty and abuse drove him to action. With determination and compassion, Khalil developed programs to reach at-risk youth. He launched a mentorship program, pairing troubled teens with successful adults who had overcome similar backgrounds. Khalil spent weeks recruiting and training mentors, carefully matching them with teens who needed guidance most. He also created a mobile outreach program, bringing resources directly to underserved neighborhoods. A converted school bus became a roving library and computer lab, offering kids a safe space to study and explore their interests. Despite initial setbacks, Khalil's persistence began to pay off. More kids started showing up to mentorship sessions. The mobile library buzzed with activity. Street basketball tournaments subtly incorporated life skills workshops. Local businesses offered internship opportunities, giving teens a glimpse of life beyond their current circumstances. As months passed, Khalil saw small signs of progress. He often lay awake at night, wondering about the long-term impact of his work. Could these programs create lasting change in the community? Then came a breakthrough. Maria, a teenager who had initially scoffed at Khalil's program, burst into his office with tears of joy. She had been accepted to college, the first in her family to have that opportunity. As Maria hugged Khalil, thanking him for believing in her, he felt a surge of hope, unlike anything he'd experienced before. Maria's triumph was just the beginning. Khalil knew there would be more lives to touch, more systems to change. His journey was far from over, but with each small victory, his resolve only grew stronger. Khalil's personal story began to spark a movement far beyond the streets he once called home. As local news outlets picked up his journey from poverty to community leader, invitations to speak at schools, community centers, and city hall poured in. Thrust into an unexpected spotlight, Khalil found himself navigating a whirlwind of interviews and engagements. The power of his story to change hearts and minds became evident as he shared his experiences. In boardrooms and classrooms, people listened intently as Khalil described his transformation from victim to mentor. Expressions shifted from skepticism to empathy, from indifference to determination. His words opened eyes to the realities of poverty and abuse lurking beneath the surface of their city. As Khalil's influence grew, so did the challenges he faced. He grappled with balancing his increased public role and his commitment to hands-on mentoring. Khalil knew his power to affect change stemmed from his authenticity and deep understanding of at-risk youth struggles. He couldn't afford to lose that connection. The true extent of Khalil's impact became clear when the mayor announced a significant policy change. Inspired by Khalil's advocacy, the city was implementing a comprehensive youth support program, combining education, mentorship, and family services. As Khalil listened to the announcement, his heart raced with a mix of pride and trepidation. His words, his story, had helped shape the future of his city. Khalil knew the path ahead would require careful navigation. The spotlight was both a tool and a potential distraction. As he stepped off the stage, Khalil steeled himself for the challenges to come, knowing that his journey was far from over. Khalil stood at the podium, gazing out at the sea of faces before him. The journey from a scared, hungry boy to the man he'd become felt surreal. Faith had anchored him, the community had embraced him, and his own perseverance had carried him through the darkest nights. As he spoke, Khalil saw hope flickering in the eyes of those listening. His words held power, transforming pain into purpose. With each sentence, he felt the weight of his experiences lifting, replaced by a sense of connection with his audience. Khalil took a deep breath, his voice steady as he delivered his final message.
No darkness is too deep for light to penetrate.
The truth of those words resonated through the room. His life stood as testimony that even in the bleakest circumstances, hope could take root and flourish. As he stepped away from the podium, Khalil knew that his story would continue to inspire long after the echoes of his speech faded.